The 9/11 attacks. One of the most devastating and deadliest terrorist attacks in American history. The attacks against New York City and Washington, D.C. caused extensive death and destruction and triggered an enormous U.S. effort to combat terrorism. Since this tragic event took place, multiple changes have been made throughout our country. Some of these changes can be seen in our government, air travel, and architecture in our skyscrapers. Most, if not all, of these changes were made with the intention to better protect the citizens of our country. Although it has nearly been 17 years since the attacks, the changes made after them have had a lasting impact on our nation. The mastermind behind 9/11 was Khalid Muhammad, a longtime jihadist with a violent hatred for the United States. Prior to 9/11, Muhammad helped his nephew plan an attack on the Twin Towers in 1993. He joined Al-Qaeda, a militant organization established in Afghanistan 3 years later. Al-Qaeda supported Muhammad's plan to hijack commercial airlines and attack national landmarks that represent U.S. power. The World Trade Center as a symbol of capitalism, the Pentagon as the symbol of American military power, and the Capitol or White House as centers of U.S. political authority. The hijackers entered the U.S. legally in 2000 with the intent to launch their hijacking simultaneously. They overpowered and killed the pilots, while new pilots took over the controls of the planes. Now in control of 4 commercial planes with more than 20,000 gallons of fuel in each, the hijackers set the planes on course toward their targets. At 8:46 a.m., the first aircraft, American Airlines Flight 11, crashed into the North Tower of the Trade Center. The first plane crash was originally assumed to be an incident involving a small commuter plane, but 18 minutes after the first impact, the second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, making it clear this was no mistake. At the time of the attack, President George W. Bush was visiting an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, to promote his new administration's education policy, unaware of the devastation taking place in New York. At 9:05 a.m., Andrew Card, the chief of staff, whispered to the president that a second plane had just hit the second tower in New York. Bush concluded that the United States was under attack. After hearing about the attacks, President Bush made a quick speech to address the situation at the elementary school before being rushed to Air Force One to be flown to D.C.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today we've had a national tragedy.
The towers usually accommodated around 50,000 staff and 40,000 visitors, but were only half full at the time of the attack. Each building was badly damaged by the crash of the planes and erupted into multiple fires. Office workers who were trapped above the points of impact in some cases leapt to their deaths rather than face the infernos now raging inside the towers. The heat of the fires severely damaged the steel frames of the buildings, eventually causing the towers to collapse. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed, and the North Tower fell 29 minutes later. Clouds of smoke and debris quickly filled the streets of Lower Manhattan. A number of buildings near the towers suffered severe damage, and several collapsed as well due to the debris of the Twin Towers. Fires at the World Trade Center site smoldered for more than 3 months. As millions watched the attacks unfold in New York, a third aircraft, American Airlines Flight 77, hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m., killing hundreds of staff members inside instantly. Minutes after the attack, the Federal Aviation Authority ordered a nationwide ground stop, grounding all planes in the U.S. airspace at the time in an attempt to weed out any other hijacked planes. In the fourth and final plane, United Airlines Flight 93, the passengers had learned about the fate of the other 3 hijacked planes and managed to rush the hijackers of their flight. At 10:02 a.m., Flight 93 crash-landed in a field outside of Washington, ultimately preventing the plane from potentially crashing into the U.S. Capitol or the White House. All passengers were killed upon impact. There were nearly 2,750 casualties at the World Trade Center site, with 184 at the Pentagon and 40 in Pennsylvania. All 19 terrorists died as well. Included in the total casualty number were more than 400 police officers and firefighters who had lost their lives after rushing into the scene and into the towers. To keep the president safe, President Bush was flown from Florida to Washington, D.C. in Air Force One, but only landed once Washington was deemed safe to enter. At 8:30 p.m., President Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office for the first time since the attacks.
Freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
On September 14th, Bush visited Ground Zero, the debris site of what remained of the World Trade Center and the thousands who had perished there. In an interview with Time magazine, President Bush explains his time at Ground Zero.
The place was lined with rescue workers who were there to see the president. I tried to shake every hand. I wanted to encourage people as the best I could.
So what physical changes have been made to our country following these attacks? Some of the most immediate and drastic changes that took place after the attacks were in U.S. airports. 2 months after the attacks, Congress federalized airport security by passing the Aviation and Transportation Security Act. This act created the Transportation Security Administration, also referred to as the TSA. The newly implemented procedures by the TSA included stricter guidelines on passenger and luggage screening. Only passengers who had tickets would pass through security, and multiple machines and procedures were introduced to scan for weaponry and destructive items within passengers' luggage. As new threats were discovered after the 9/11 attacks, new procedures were introduced, including removing shoes and banning liquids. Huge changes were also made in our airplanes. Fortified cockpit doors were introduced, and first-class cabin curtains were dropped by some airlines. Pilots could also now apply to become a federal flight deck officer, allowing them to carry a loaded gun and act as a federal officer aboard the plane. Changes in our government were very prominent after the 9/11 attacks. More than 130 pieces of 9/11 related legislation were introduced in the 107th Congress in the year after the attacks, with 48 bills and resolutions approved or signed into law. Acts like the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act, James Sidroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act of 2010, and bills like the Post-9/11 GI Bill were all introduced. The Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act required the State Department and Immigration to share visa and immigrant data with each other. The Post-9/11 GI Bill gave education funding to soldiers, and the James Sidroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act of 2010 provided $4.2 billion for the health of people who worked at Ground Zero during and after the attacks. Multiple government agencies were created after 9/11, some including the Department of Homeland Security, which consolidated other agencies including the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Changes within the architecture of our skyscrapers were also very prominent. The International Code Council released post-9/11 building code suggestions to make skyscrapers safer and able to withstand similar incidents, at least long enough to evacuate occupants. These changes include more stairways for structures taller than about 42 stories, elevators that can be used during emergencies, higher fire resistance and impact resistant walls for elevator shafts and exit stairways. The materials of these buildings have also been improved significantly. The World Trade Center towers' main support systems were made out of steel columns. These columns lost strength rapidly when the fires inside reached over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Concrete, however, is virtually fireproof. The new One World Trade Center building takes advantage of this. 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls sit at the core of the building, running the full height of the skyscraper. In addition to containing large amounts of specifically designed reinforced bars, these walls are made of high-strength concrete, meaning they can withstand the high pressures of explosions of any kind. The 9/11 attacks were without a doubt a tragedy in our country. The attacks themselves not only caused physical destruction in our country, but also caused disastrous casualty numbers among the 3 crash sites of the event. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks, and television broadcasts of the event horrified viewers around the world. It was the greatest disaster ever to hit New York, and it prompted outpouring of sympathy across the globe. Although positive security outcomes came out of this event, the attack still remained a tragedy in the eyes of our nation.